6 months ago, Eleanor Brooks was nobody to Julian Whitmore. She was a name he never learned to face. He never saw a signature on a termination notice. He signed without reading. She mopped the floors of his building at 2 in the morning, while he slept in a penthouse 40 stories above her. She stretched every dollar to keep her son fed and the lights on. And one afternoon, without warning, she received a letter that ended her employment at Whitmore Global, authorized by a man who didn't know she existed. Today, Julian Whitmore has nothing. His accounts are frozen. His mansion is sealed. His phone rings and nobody answers. The men who once fought for seats at his table have vanished so completely, it's as if they were never there. He sits on a bench outside the financial district he once owned, wearing a wrinkled suit that used to cost more than Eleanor made in 3 months, and he is closer to disappearing than he has ever been. That is the moment Eleanor finds him. She reaches into her bag and places something in his hand quietly, without explanation. Julian looks down. He goes completely still. Every person who had reason to stay walked away, and the one person who had every reason to walk away showed up. Why? If you've ever believed that kindness has to be earned before it's given, stay with this one. And if stories like this are the kind that stay with you, consider subscribing. There's more where this came from. Julian Whitmore did not run a company. He ran a world. At 52, he occupied the 72nd floor of the Whitmore Global Tower in downtown Manhattan, a glass and steel monument that bore his family name and cast a long shadow over everything below it. His mornings began at 6 with a briefing from his chief of staff. His afternoons moved between boardrooms, private calls, and signed documents stacked in neat leather folders. His evenings ended at rooftop dinners where waiters knew his usual order before he sat down. I was not a cruel man. That was the part nobody ever said out loud, but everyone around him understood. Julian did not raise his voice. He did not humiliate people in meetings. He did not take pleasure in other people's failures. He was by every visible measure a composed and professional man who had built something extraordinary from a name his father left him and an appetite for risk that most people couldn't stomach. But there was another truth about Julian Whitmore, one that lived quietly beneath the composure and the reputation. He did not see the people below him. Not really. Not the security guard who held the elevator every morning because he knew Julian's schedule. Not the kitchen staff on the 44th floor who restocked the executive lounge before dawn. Not the woman who mopped the corridors of the 14th floor at 2 in the morning, 5 days a week for 3 years, who had never once been acknowledged by name in the building that paid her wages. To Julian, the people at the bottom of the organization were not people in the way that mattered to the spreadsheets. They were operational costs. Line items. Variables to be adjusted when margins tightened. He did not hate them. He simply did not think about them long enough to form any feeling at all. Eleanor Brooks had been thinking about survival for most of her adult life. She was 34, a single mother, and she had learned early that the distance between stable and desperate was much shorter than anyone with a salary liked to admit. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Bronx with her son Marcus, who was 9 years old and already too perceptive for his age. She worked the night shift at Whitmore Global 5 days a week, clocking in at 10 and out at 6, and she took the subway home in the early morning light, while the rest of the city was still waking up. Eleanor was not a woman who complained. She had learned that complaining changed nothing and cost energy she could not afford to waste. She kept a small notebook where she tracked every dollar rent, groceries, Marcus's asthma medication, the occasional school trip she made work no matter what. She had a line in that notebook she called the emergency fund. It was not large, But it was hers, and she had built it slowly and deliberately, the way you build anything when you don't have the luxury of shortcuts. She was not unhappy. That was the part people tended to get wrong about women in her position. She had Marcus, and Marcus was enough to make a hard life feel like it was going somewhere. She had her dignity, which she protected with a quiet fierceness that didn't announce itself. And she had the knowledge earned through years of experience that she was capable of handling more than most people assumed. What she did not have was safety. And 6 months ago, she lost even the fragile version of it she'd managed to hold together. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was printed on Whitmore Global letterhead, formal and bloodless, informing Eleanor Brooks that her position had been eliminated as part of a company-wide restructuring initiative, effective immediately. There was a number to call for questions about her final paycheck. There was no apology. There was no name she recognized at the bottom. There was only a signature, bold fast, slightly tilted to the right. The signature of a man who had signed it, the way he signed everything quickly, between two other things, without reading the name above it. Eleanor sat in her car in the parking lot of the building. For a long time after reading it, Marcus was at school. She had nowhere she needed to be. She read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in her glove compartment. She did not cry. She told herself she would figure it out, because she always figured it out, because there was no alternative to figuring it out. Then she drove home and started making calls. Julian Whitmore signed 43 documents that morning. He does not remember any of them. The collapse of Whitmore Global did not happen the way Julian had always imagined failure might happen, slowly, with warning signs he could read and respond to. It happened in 72 hours. On a Monday morning, a financial journalist published a detailed investigation into a series of leveraged transactions that had moved quietly through Whitmore Global's investment arm over the previous 2 years. The numbers were complicated. The implications were not. By noon, the stock had dropped 18%. By 3 o'clock, the Securities and Exchange Commission had opened a formal inquiry. By the time Julian's lawyer called him that evening, 3 board members had already retained separate legal counsel. Tuesday was worse. The banks moved faster than Julian's team could respond. 2 major credit lines were suspended pending the investigation. His primary account was frozen before he reached the office. He arrived at the tower at 7:15 to find a federal agent in the lobby and his chief of staff waiting by the elevator, with an expression Julian had never seen on her face before. "They're asking everyone to gather their personal belongings," she said. She did not make eye contact when she said it. By Wednesday afternoon, Julian Whitmore walked out of the building that bore his name carrying a single cardboard box. Inside it, a framed photograph of his parents, a fountain pen his father had given him when he turned 30, and a book he had never gotten around to reading. Security held the door for him on the way out. I was not sure if that was kindness or habit. The photographers were waiting on the sidewalk. What followed was the particular kind of destruction that only happens to men who have spent decades at the top. It was not just financial. Julian had known abstractly that a reversal of fortune was always possible. That was the nature of risk, and he had built his career on understanding risk. What he had not understood, not truly, was how completely his life had been constructed from other people's willingness to be near power. His phone showed him everything he needed to know. 41 unread messages on Monday, 17 on Tuesday, 4 on Wednesday, all from journalists. By Thursday, the only person who called was his attorney, and those conversations cost him $400 an hour he was no longer sure he could pay. The friends disappeared first, or rather, Julian discovered they had never quite been friends in the way the word implied. The dinners and the invitations, and the easy camaraderie of men, with money in common, evaporated so quickly it left him disoriented, the way you feel when a piece of furniture you've walked around for years is suddenly gone and you keep almost tripping over the space where it used to be. Then the practical things began to unravel. His corporate card stopped working on Wednesday evening. The car service that had driven him for 11 years sent a politely worded email explaining that his account had been suspended. The penthouse was flagged as a potential asset in the investigation, and his attorney strongly advised him not to return to it while the inquiry was active. Julian Whitmore, who had not carried cash in years, found himself standing on a sidewalk in Midtown Manhattan with $40 in his wallet and nowhere to go. He walked. He moved through the streets in his suit, the good one charcoal gray made by a tailor in London, and he felt the city around him with a sharpness that was entirely new. The noise of it, the indifference of it. The way nobody looked at him, not because they were being polite, but because he was no longer the kind of man people looked at. He ended up on a bench near the edge of the financial district, across from a coffee cart he couldn't afford to buy from. He sat there as the afternoon turned gray and the lights in the towers came on one floor at a time, and he watched them the way you watch something that used to belong to you. For the first time in his adult life, Julian Whitmore did not know what came next. He was still sitting there when Eleanor Brooks walked by and stopped. Eleanor almost kept walking. She had finished a double shift at a diner on Lexington, a job she had picked up 3 weeks after losing her position at Whitmore Global, one of two. She was now working to keep the rent current, and she was tired in the specific way that settled into her lower back and stayed there. Marcus had a half day tomorrow. She needed to stop at the pharmacy before it closed. Then she saw him. She recognized Julian Whitmore, the way you recognize someone you have observed from a distance for years without ever speaking, to the shape of him, the posture, the particular way he held himself even now, sitting on a public bench in a suit that had lost its press. She had seen his photograph in the lobby of his own building hundreds of times. She had cleaned the glass on his framed portrait every Tuesday for 3 years. He had never seen her at all. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at him. This man whose signature had ended 6 years of her working life, and she waited to feel something sharp. Satisfaction, maybe. Or anger finally given a target. What she felt instead was something quieter and harder to name. He looked lost. Not in a temporary way. In the way of someone who had just discovered that the map they had been using their whole life was for a different city entirely. Eleanor shifted the pharmacy bag on her shoulder and walked toward him. Julian looked up when he heard footsteps stop in front of him. He saw a woman in a dark coat watching him with an expression he couldn't immediately read. "You're Julian Whitmore," she said. It was not a question. "I was," he said, and then felt foolish for saying it. She sat down on the other end of the bench. Not close. She didn't ask permission. She simply sat the way people sit when they've been on their feet all day, and the opportunity to be off them is not something you pass up regardless of the circumstances. "I worked in your building," she said. "Night shift, 14th floor." Julian looked at her. He searched his memory with the genuine effort of a man who was only now understanding how little of it he had used for the people around him. He found nothing. No image, no conversation, no moment of recognition. "I'm sorry," he said. I know you don't," she said. Not unkindly, just plainly. They sat in silence for a moment. On the street in front of them, a cab honked. Someone laughed loudly into a phone. "I lost my job," she said then. 6 months ago. Restructuring. She let the words sit there without decoration. Eleanor reached into her bag. She took out a small envelope and placed it on the bench between them. She didn't push it toward him. She simply set it there in the space between where she ended and he began. "There's enough in there for a room for a few nights," she said. "A decent meal, maybe a phone call to someone who can actually help you." She stood adjusting the strap of her bag. "You don't have to take it. But I've been where you are. Not the money part." She paused. "The part where you can't see a way forward." Julian stared at the envelope. Everything in him, every instinct built across 52 years of being a man in control of things, told him not to touch it. That accepting it was a humiliation he could not afford, on top of every other humiliation this week had handed him. He picked it up. He didn't open it. He just held it. And Eleanor was already walking away toward the pharmacy, the coat she had worn for 3 winters, moving around her in the evening wind. "What's your name?" he called after her. She glanced back once. "Eleanor Brooks," she said. "You signed my termination papers." Then she was gone. Julian did not sleep that night. He lay on the narrow bed of a motel room on West 46th Street, the kind of place that charged by the night and asked no questions, and stared at the ceiling with the envelope on the nightstand beside him. The room smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet. The radiator clicked and hissed in the corner. He had counted the money before he checked in. It was enough for 3 nights, with some left over. The bills were mostly 20s, a few 10s, folded neatly and held together with a small rubber band. He kept thinking about the way she had placed it between them. Not handed it to him, placed it. As if she understood that his hands might not be ready to reach for it yet. He told himself there had to be an angle. That was the world he knew, the world where generosity was a transaction, dressed in better clothing, where every favor carried an invoice that arrived later. Eleanor Brooks had lost her job because of a document he signed. The most logical explanation for her behavior was that she was building a case, planning something he couldn't yet see. He repeated this to himself until sometime before dawn, when exhaustion finally pulled him under. Ciao. In the days that followed, Julian bought a prepaid phone with part of Eleanor's money, contacted his attorney, Daniel Reeves, one of 3 people who still returned his calls, and ate at a diner 2 blocks from the motel, where the coffee was bad, and the portions were large, and no one recognized him. He thought about Eleanor constantly, and he could not explain why. On the 3rd day, he saw her by accident. I was walking back from a payphone on Lexington Avenue when he spotted her half a block ahead, moving at the pace of someone who had places to be and no time to waste. He watched her push through the door of a small restaurant and through the window tie an apron around her waist and begin moving between tables. This was her 2nd job. The diner on Lexington picked up after Whitmore Global let her go. She moved efficiently without complaint, with a focused energy that reminded him of people he had respected in boardrooms, people who understood exactly what needed to be done and did not waste time on anything else. He stood on the opposite sidewalk longer than he should have. He thought about the number he had once calculated the percentage of labor costs acceptable to cut, and how he had presented it to the board as a strategic decision, and felt nothing more complicated than the satisfaction of a problem solved. They spoke again 4 days after the bench. Julian had returned to the same block, not admitting to himself that he was looking for her until she appeared at the end of the street. She saw him and slowed. She did not seem surprised. "You're still here," she said. "I don't have anywhere else to be," he said. They walked together for half a block before either of them spoke again. "I have to ask you something," Julian said. "You want to know why I helped you?" Yes, Eleanor was quiet for a moment. They stopped at a corner and waited for the light. After I lost my job, she said, there were about 3 weeks where I didn't tell anyone. Not my sister, not my son's school, nobody. I just kept moving like everything was fine because I didn't know what else to do. She looked straight ahead at the crossing signal. One night I was sitting in my car outside the grocery store, and I realized I'd been there for 40 minutes, and I hadn't gone in yet. I just couldn't make myself move. She paused. A woman knocked on my window. Older woman, didn't know her. She asked if I was okay. That was all. I said yes. She nodded and walked away. The light changed. They crossed. I went inside and bought what Marcus needed and figured out the next thing. Because someone had knocked on the window. Julian said nothing for a long moment. I'm not her, Eleanor said. And you're not me. But I know what it looks like when someone can't make themselves move. She glanced at him briefly. I knocked on the window. What you do next is your part. Julian walked the rest of the block in silence. He was not thinking about the money anymore. I was thinking about a woman who had spent 40 minutes alone in a parking lot, and the 3 years she had spent cleaning his building without him ever once learning her name. The shame of it was quiet and total, and there was nowhere to put it down. The attorney's name was Daniel Reeves, 60 years old, semi-retired, the kind of lawyer who had seen enough of the industry to no longer be impressed by it. He had worked with Julian 12 years ago and had, by his own admission, never entirely trusted the direction Whitmore Global took after that. They met in his small, cluttered office on a Tuesday morning. I need to understand what I signed, Julian said. Everything from the 18 months before the collapse. Every personnel decision, every restructuring document, everything that went through my desk. Daniel pulled a thick folder from his drawer. I had a feeling you'd ask that eventually, he said. Julian worked through it slowly. He read personnel memos and budget approvals and quarterly restructuring summaries that he had once processed in minutes, signing at the bottom of each page without reading past the executive summary. Seeing them now name by name, line by line, was a different experience entirely. He had approved the elimination of a custodial contract covering 47 workers across 3 buildings. The memo described it as a shift to third-party vendor services to reduce fixed labor costs by 11%. He had signed it on a Thursday, between a conference call and a lunch meeting. He had not read the attachment. The attachment listed the names. He kept going. Benefits reductions, extended probationary periods, policy changes that reclassified part-time overnight staff and made them ineligible for the company's health coverage. He had signed all of it. Quickly, consistently, without stopping. Then he reached page 41. The document was a standard termination notice, one of dozens in the batch. His eyes moved down the list the way they always had, quickly looking for numbers rather than people. Then the name stopped him. Eleanor Brooks. Custodial Services Floor 14. Contract terminated. Effective immediately. His signature was at the bottom of the page. Bold. Fast. Slightly tilted to the right. Julian set the document down. He picked it up again. Read it again. Set it down again. Daniel looked over from his desk. You all right? Julian did not answer. I was thinking about an envelope placed between 2 people on a bench. A woman who had said, I know what it looks like when someone can't make themselves move, and who had said it without bitterness, without any apparent awareness that the man she was speaking to was the same man who had taken her livelihood away with a signature he didn't remember making. He had not known. That was the true part. He had genuinely not known. Her name, had not read the list, had not made a deliberate decision to remove Eleanor Brooks from her livelihood and hand her a crisis she would have to solve alone. But the not knowing that was the whole problem. He had built a company large enough that the people at the bottom of it became invisible to him. Not through malice, through the accumulated habit of a man who had optimized his attention upward toward investors, toward board members, toward the tier of people whose names appeared on the same documents as his, and in doing so had made everyone below that tier into something closer to furniture than to human beings. Eleanor had not been a cost reduction. She had been a woman with a son and a pharmacy bag and a small rubber-banded stack of bills she had saved against exactly the kind of emergency that his signature had created for her. "I need to find out who put this restructuring package together," Julian said finally. "The whole thing. Who designed it, who pushed it through the board, who benefited from the cuts." Daniel looked at him carefully. "If we start pulling that thread, it's not going to lead somewhere comfortable. For anyone. Including you." Julian looked at the page on the desk, at his own signature. "I'm already not comfortable," he said. Victor Harlan had worked alongside Julian for 14 years. I was 61, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore his authority so naturally that people often assumed he ran whatever room he entered. Julian had brought him in as a senior financial advisor when Whitmore Global was still finding its footing, and Victor had been there for every major expansion since present at the table, for every celebration, every crisis, every decision that shaped the company into what it became. Julian had trusted him the way you trust someone who has been in the room for all of it. He had considered him a friend. That was the part he kept returning to as Daniel laid out what the documents showed. The picture that emerged was not complicated once you knew where to look. Victor had identified the conditions for Whitmore Global's collapse 18 months before it happened, and not because he predicted the market, but because he engineered the vulnerability himself. He had quietly redirected high-risk debt instruments into the company's core investment portfolio, masking them beneath legitimate transactions that Julian's signature had authorized. He had cultivated 3 board members who stood to benefit from the resulting asset liquidation. And he had timed the financial journalist's investigation, feeding the information himself through an intermediary to coincide with the moment the legal exposure would land entirely on Julian. By the time the company fell, Victor had already arranged the acquisition of Whitmore Global's most valuable subsidiary through a holding company that could not be easily traced back to him. "He used you," Daniel said. "He used your signature, your reputation, and your habit of not reading what you signed." "Can we prove it?" "Enough of it," Daniel said. "Whether it fully clears you is a different question." "Set up a meeting," Julian said. "Just the 2 of us." They met in the conference room of a neutral law office on a Thursday afternoon. Victor arrived first, dressed impeccably unhurried, wearing the expression of a man who had prepared for this conversation and found reasons not to be afraid. Julian placed a folder on the table. "You built this over 18 months, he said, "while I was signing whatever you put in front of me. While you were running the company the way you always ran it," Victor said. "Efficiently, at altitude, trusting the people below you to handle the details." He smiled slightly. "That's not a criticism. That's just accurate." Julian slid a document across the table. "The debt instruments, the board communications, the holding company." Victor glanced at it without touching it. "You have pieces, interesting pieces. But everything you're holding has your name on it too. Your signature. Your authorization." He paused. "You want to go public with this, we'll both burn. But I've already moved what mattered. You haven't." Julian said nothing. "You were never a bad businessman," Victor continued. "You were just comfortable. You liked the view from the top, and you trusted the machinery to run without you watching it. That made you useful. He straightened his cufflinks. The people at the bottom don't need to be seen. The people in the middle handle the details. The person at the top signs and moves on. That's the system you built, Julian. I didn't invent it. I just learned it from the best. Julian felt the words arrive with a precision that no legal argument could have matched. Because Victor was not entirely wrong. Julian had built a culture of distance, not deliberately, not cruelly, but systematically. He had rewarded efficiency over accountability. He had promoted people who delivered results without asking him to look too closely at how those results were produced. He had created the conditions under which a man like Victor could operate for 14 months unseen, because invisibility was already the default setting for everyone who wasn't at the top. Victor stood and buttoned his jacket. If you go forward with this, I'll release everything. Every document, every name, every decision you signed off on that you didn't read. He moved toward the door. Your call. Julian sat alone in the conference room after Victor left. On the table in front of him were the documents that could end Victor Harlan, and the documents that would, in the same motion, show the world exactly what kind of man Julian Whitmore had been before a woman he'd never noticed placed an envelope on a bench and walked away. He picked up his phone and called Daniel Reeves. Do it, he said. All of it. We go public with everything. Daniel was quiet for a moment. You understand what that means for you? Yes, Julian said. He did. Chapter 2. The story broke on a Friday morning. Daniel had worked with a financial journalist, one with a reputation for accuracy over speed, and the piece ran with documentation attached. It named Victor Harlan. It traced the debt instrument and the board communications and the timing of the coordinated leak. It was thorough and it was damaging, and it was by every standard Daniel could identify the truth. It also named Julian Whitmore, not as a co-conspirator, but as the man whose signature appeared on every document, whose management culture had made the fraud possible, whose habit of governing from a distance had created the blind spots Victor exploited. The piece was fair in the way that honest things are fair. It did not call Julian evil, but it did not let him be a simple victim either. By noon, it had been picked up by every major financial outlet in the country. Julian read it in Daniel's office. He read it slowly all the way through, including the section on the custodial layoffs and the benefits reductions. He read his own name in sentences he could not argue with. He read the word negligence used in a context that was accurate and that sat in his chest like something with weight. When he finished, he closed the browser and sat back. Victor's attorney has already called, Daniel said. They're threatening a countersuit. Let them, Julian said. That evening, he went to find Eleanor. He stood outside her building for several minutes before pressing the buzzer. She answered the intercom with the particular wariness of a woman who had learned not to expect good news from unannounced visitors. It's Julian Whitmore, he said. A long pause. I know, she said. The door buzzed open. Her apartment was small and clean, and arranged with the careful precision of someone who had learned to make limited space feel intentional. Marcus's drawings covered the refrigerator door, bright, energetic, a skyline of buildings he had invented himself. A pair of small sneakers sat by the entrance. The kitchen smelled like something that had been cooked recently, something warm. Eleanor stood in the middle of the room with her arms folded. Not hostile. Just contained. She had the posture of someone who had decided to hear him out and reserved the right to end it at any point. Julian stood near the door. The story ran today, he said. I saw it, she said. I wanted you to know that I found your file 3 weeks ago in Daniel's office. He paused. Page 41. Eleanor's expression did not change, but something shifted in it, a slight tightening around the eyes, a settling of the jaw. I signed it, Julian said. I signed it, and I didn't read your name. I approved the whole package in 15 minutes between 2 other meetings, and I went to lunch, and I didn't think about it again. He stopped. I need you to know that I know that. Not because it changes anything, but because you deserve to know that I know. The apartment was very quiet. Eleanor walked to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and set it on the counter. She did not offer it to him. It seemed to be something she needed to do with her hands. Then she turned and looked at him directly. Knowing you didn't mean to, she said, doesn't make it hurt less. It just tells me how invisible we were. Not worth a second look. Not worth 30 extra seconds. Her voice was level, completely level. You didn't fire me, Julian. You erased me, and you didn't even notice you'd done it. Julian had no answer for that. It was simply completely true. Eleanor sat down at the small table by the window. After a moment, she gestured at the chair across from her. Julian sat. Tell me what happened, she said. Not the legal version. What actually happened to you, he told her. Not the polished account he had given Daniel. He told her about the morning the broke standing in the lobby, watching a federal agent speak quietly to his chief of staff. He told her about the cardboard box and the fountain pen and the photographers on the sidewalk. He told her about the 41 messages that became 17, that became 4, that became none. He told her about lying in the motel room, staring at the ceiling, running the logic of her kindness through every cynical framework he had, and coming up empty every time. He told her about page 41. I sat in Daniel's office for 40 minutes after I found it, he said. I didn't say anything. I kept thinking I had that document in my hands for maybe 3 seconds. 3 seconds, and then I moved on. And you had to live inside what those 3 seconds produced. Eleanor listened without interrupting, not filling the spaces in his sentences the way people do when they are waiting for their turn to speak, but simply waiting with a quality of attention he was not accustomed to receiving. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. After I got the letter, she said, I wasn't thinking about money. I knew I'd figure the money out somehow because I'd done it before, and there wasn't another option. She looked at the window. I was thinking about the fact that I had given 6 years to that building. 6 years of showing up on time, doing the work right, never calling in, unless Marcus was sick enough that I had no other choice. 6 years of being the person who made sure everything was clean and ready before anyone arrived. She turned back to him. And the person who ended it didn't know my name, didn't know I existed. Signed a piece of paper and went to lunch. She said it without heat, without performance. She was simply telling him what was true. The worst part wasn't losing the job, she continued. Jobs end. The worst part was realizing that to the person who ended it, I was already nothing. I hadn't become nothing by being fired. I had always been nothing from the beginning in that building. The firing just made it official. Julian sat with that for a long moment. I built that, he said quietly. That's what I built. A place where you could work for 6 years and be nothing. Yes, Eleanor said, simply, without absolution. They sat in silence. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere down the hall, a television murmured. I don't know how to fix it, Julian said. Not for the 47 people on that contract, or the ones who lost benefits, or any of it. I can't reach back. You can't, Eleanor said. That's not how it works. Then what does She looked at him steadily. You stop asking me to tell you how to feel better about it, she said. That's not my job. It was never my job. She stood. What you do from here, that's yours. Julian nodded slowly. I came here to apologize, he said. Properly, if you'll let me. Eleanor leaned against the counter and crossed her arms, not defensively, but in the way of someone deciding how much of themselves to offer to a moment that still had the potential to disappoint them. Then say something real, she said. Don't tell me you didn't mean to. I already know that. Tell me what you actually understand. Julian sat forward. I understand that I ran a company for 30 years and never once asked what it felt like to work at the bottom of it, he said. I understand that I made decisions that affected hundreds of people and treated that responsibility like paperwork. I understand that you had to figure out how to keep your son's life intact because of something I signed in 15 minutes, and that there's no version of that I can make right. He stopped. I understand that you showing up on that bench was an act of generosity I had done nothing to earn, and I understand that I don't get to decide what it means to you, only what I do with it. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She did not say, I forgive you. She did not say thank you. She said nothing for long enough that Julian understood the silence was itself a response, not a rejection, but a withholding of something she was not yet ready to give and had every right to keep. Victor Harlan was formally charged 6 weeks later. The SEC investigation, combined with Daniel's documentation and the cooperation of 2 board members seeking reduced exposure, produced a case substantial enough that Victor's attorneys advised him to negotiate. By the end of the 2nd month, the charges were filed. Julian's own legal situation was slower. He cooperated fully with the SEC from the beginning. There would be fines. There would be restrictions on his activities while the inquiry remained active. There would be a period during which his name carried a specific and unflattering set of associations in every room he entered. He had accepted this as the arithmetic of what he had built and how he had run it. What surprised him was how little he resented it. He returned to Eleanor's building on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after their conversation at her kitchen table. He had called ahead. She had picked up after 4 rings and said Saturday morning was fine. He brought the envelope back, the original, with the bills inside plus a carefully calculated additional amount representing fair interest for the period he had held it. He handed it to her at the door and told her what it was. Eleanor looked at the envelope. She did not take it immediately. I don't want more than what I've, she said. The extra is interest, Julian said. You extended credit to someone who was a poor risk. That has a cost. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. She took the envelope. I have a question, Julian said. When you handed me the envelope on the bench, did you know that your name was on the termination notice? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. I knew it came from your office, she said. I didn't know if you personally signed it, but I assumed someone at your level had authorized it. She looked at the envelope. So yes, I knew enough. Then why, Julian said, knowing what you knew? Eleanor leaned against the doorframe. Down the hall he could hear Marcus, some kind of game, the sound of small feet on a hard floor. Because I had spent 6 months being angry, she said. At the system, at the building, at the version of you I had constructed in my head. And I realized that anger was the only thing I was feeding. Every day I woke up and I fed it. And it wasn't making me stronger. It was just making me someone I didn't want Marcus to grow up watching. She looked at him directly. I helped you because I needed to know I could. Because I wanted to be the kind of person who could look at someone who had hurt them even without meaning to and still choose to be decent. She paused. Not for you, for me, and for him. Julian nodded. He did not try to absorb it into a narrative about himself. He let it be what it was, her story, her reasons, her choice. I'm starting something new, he said. Smaller, different structure, transparent compensation named accountability at every level. No one at the bottom who isn't known by name by the people at the top. He paused. I know what the alternative looks like. I'm done with it. Eleanor studied him. If that's real, she said, then do it. Don't announce it. Don't make it a story about your redemption. Just do it and let it speak. She straightened. The people you hire will know within 3 months whether you mean it or not. They always know. I know, Julian said. That's what I'm counting on. 3 months later, Julian Whitmore opened a small office on the 6th floor of an unremarkable building in Lower Manhattan. There was no ceremony, no press release. There were 11 people on the first day, and he knew all 11 names before they arrived, because he had read every application himself and made a point of remembering. He made the coffee that morning. On his desk, plain nothing, custom nothing, that cost more than function required. He kept one thing that had not been there before. A small piece of paper folded once that he had written himself the morning after he sat at Eleanor's kitchen table and finally heard what he had spent 30 years being too elevated to listen to. It said, "You signed it. You didn't read the name. Don't do that again." Eleanor Brooks still worked 2 jobs. She had recently added reception work at a medical office, better pay, closer to home. She was saving toward a certification program in healthcare administration. It would take 2 years. She had started the notebook for it already, a new one, same system as always. Every dollar tracked, every goal written in her own handwriting, every step forward documented, because documentation was how you proved to yourself that you were moving. Marcus was doing well in school. He had informed Eleanor with great seriousness that he intended to become an architect. She had told him that was an excellent idea and looked up library books on the subject that same evening. His latest drawing, a skyscraper of his own invention, was folded in her coat pocket on a Tuesday morning in early spring as she walked to work, the light coming in low and gold between the buildings. She walked at the pace of someone who had somewhere to be. She did not think about Julian Whitmore often. When she did, it was not with anger or warmth or any of the complicated emotions she had expected the experience to leave behind. It was with something quieter than any of those. She had knocked on the window. He had gone inside. What he did with it was his. What she had done with it was already hers. Decision the morning after the slow return to herself that began the moment she chose not to let someone else's indifference determine the size of her own heart. Julian wasn't saved by a large check or a dramatic gesture. He was saved by a small envelope from a woman who had every reason to walk past him and chose not to. Eleanor wasn't made whole by an apology or a returned favor. She was made whole by a decision she made herself long before Julian ever understood what she had given him. The most powerful thing in this story isn't the money. It's the choice. The choice to remain decent when bitterness would have been easier. The choice to see a person when the system had taught you to see a problem. The choice to knock on the window not because the other person deserves it, but because you want to be the kind of person who does. That choice is available to all of us, every day, in smaller moments than this, but with the same weight. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories about the kind of quiet courage that doesn't make the headlines but changes everything, subscribe. We'll be here.